Greetings and Durud. Welcome to the debut edition of Farhang Literature, Farhang Foundation's first ever book club. I am Ali Reza Ardekani, Executive Director of Farhang Foundation, and we're delighted to have you with us for what promises to be a remarkable conversation about one of the most talked about books of 2024. Today, we are honored to welcome author and poet, Mr. Kaveh Akbar, to discuss his incredible new book, Martyr. Martyr became an instant New York Times bestseller from the moment it was released and has been selected as one of the best books of 2024 by both the New York Times Book Review and the New Yorker, amongst others. It was also recently chosen as one of President Barack Obama's favorite reads of 2024. Kaveh Akbar's poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Paris Review, and Best American Poetry. He is the author of 2 poetry collections, Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, as well as a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. He is also the editor of the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse, 100 Poets on the Divine. In 2020, Kaveh was named Poetry Editor of The Nation. Among his many honors are multiple Pushcart Prizes, a Civitella Ranieri Foundation Fellowship, and a Levi's Reading Prize. Born in Tehran, Kaveh teaches at the University of Iowa and in the low residency MFA programs of Randolph College and Warren Wilson. In 2014, Kaveh founded Dive Dapper, a platform for dialogues with the most vital voices in American poetry. Along with Sarah Kay and Claire Schwartz, he co-wrote a weekly column for the Paris Review called Poetry RX. Joining Kaveh in conversation today is none other than award-winning author, screenwriter, and producer, Mr. Abdi Nazemian. Abdi is the author of 5 novels, including Like a Love Story, a Stonewall Honor Book, and The Chandler Legacies. His latest novel, Only This Beautiful Moment, won the 2024 Stonewall Award from the American Library Association. He has also received a Lambda Literary Award for his literary work. Abdi's screenwriting credits include films such as The Artist's Wife and The Quiet. He has served as a producer, executive producer, or associate producer on numerous films, including Call Me By Your Name and Little Woods. The format of today's program will begin with a one-on-one conversation between Abdi and Kaveh, and later we will host a book club talk with you, the audience members who wish to participate. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming these 2 incredible gentlemen to Farhang Literature, Mr. Kaveh Akbar and Mr. Abdi Nazemian. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you so much. What an incredible introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here. To both of you, we're honored to have you here, and I cannot wait for this conversation to start. So I will step in the background and I'll let Abdi take it from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's here. Thank you to Kaveh Akbar for writing this book, which is so powerful and so moving. And for everyone who's here, to me, art is one of the most powerful ways to create community. And I think as Iranians, we all crave community here in wherever you are, probably in the West. So I'm so excited to start this conversation. I assume everyone here has read the book, but for anyone who hasn't, I thought I would just quickly give a synopsis that I hope meets your approval, Kaveh. The book is about Cyrus Shams, who's an Iranian-American poet and recovering addict whose obsession with death and martyrs inspires him to delve deep into what it means to die and to study people who made their deaths matter. This leads him to Orkide, an artist who turns the end of her life into a visual art piece. The book delves into Cyrus's family history, his history, and relationship with his closest friend Z and his sometimes lover Z. And also it includes dream sequences featuring historical and fictional characters, which we'll be discussing soon. I'm sure it's a very hard book to synopsize because there's so much.
Yeah, that was as good of a job as I've heard. I mean, yeah, it's sort of just
Yes.
if you say it's a book about Iran, you're right. If you say it's a book about addiction, you're right. If you say it's a book about death, you're right. Art, you know, I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm glad
Yeah.
that it's not my job.
Well, I made it my job. So I want to gear, because this is a conversation for the Incredible Farhang Foundation and for Iranians, I want to gear some of the questions toward that. The first question I wanted to ask is, in the book, you discuss the idea of double consciousness, this idea that marginalized people have to see themselves through the eyes of people who hate them. Specifically, you write that Cyrus, as an Iranian, vaguely Muslim man in a country that hates those things, finds it hard not to think about, what would a person who hates me think about this? So my first question is, as Iranians, I think we all have to spend a lot of time thinking about what non-Iranians might think of us. But do you also experience some double consciousness writing for Iranians as well, for your fellow Iranians? Meaning, do you worry about what Iranians will think of your work and what you're dealing with in it?
Yeah, we're really getting into it right from the jump. First of all, thank you so much for spending such good time with the book. It's not a small gift to give someone. And thank you. I can't see those of you who are assembled, but I have faith that you're there. Thank you for being here, and for spending time with us on a Sunday afternoon. Yeah, I was born in Iran. I came to America when I was a small child, so I think they call that 1.5 generation, which even the language for it is clumsy, you know. So consequentially, in a room full of Iranian people, I feel like the least Iranian person in a room full of Americans. I've certainly never felt particularly American, right? And so that double consciousness absolutely goes both ways. That phrase is from the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, um, for thinking about, how will people who do not have the ability, capacity, or willingness to perceive my interiority as being as vital and complex as their own, how will they perceive me? How will they perceive this gesture? It's not inert to be a man with my name in this country with a book called Martyr. We've got a little bit of remove from September 11th, but seeing my book in airports, right, with that title and my name and my very, very Iranian name underneath, is still a trip to me, and it's impossible not to think about, what Joe Fox News thinks about it when and I've gotten plenty of that sort of mail too. I've heard from those people who don't read it but see the title and see my name. I don't know that reading it would particularly pacify them either, but yeah, so I get it on that sense. And then there's the ubiquitous sensation of, who am I to tell these stories? Who am I to talk about? I mean, much of the book orbits Iran Air Flight 655, which was a civilian airliner that was shot out of the sky by a U.S. naval warship on July 3rd, 1988, killing all 290 people on board, including 66 children, right? Who am I to talk about that, right? I didn't have anybody who I knew or loved on board that flight. I wasn't even born yet. My mom was in Iran pregnant with me when that happened. So she would see posters of the dead children, these dead little boys, and be like, that's what I've got growing, what this kid I've got growing inside me will look like that someday. And I don't know, who am I to tell those stories, but also, who am I to talk about anything but that? I mean, that's what I keep coming back to is, given my awareness of that, given the way that I can still feel, I mean, in my gut, in my throat, talking about it now. I mean, I just wrote a book about it. I've been talking about it for a year, and talking about it now, I can feel the anger and sadness in my throat. Who am I to talk about anything but that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had a question about that flight and how you came to choose that one specific event to be such a catalyst for the story, and also, how you wrote about, I think, something that is a very universal immigrant experience, which is the experience of gratitude for a country that takes you in, mixed with a knowledge that you wouldn't have had to flee your homeland were it not for the actions of the same country.
Perfectly
I
put.
think- Right? And I think you use this one event so brilliantly. I'm curious, one, how you came to that event of all the events in Iranian history. And two, how you feel about writing about that balance and how you feel having it be such a success in America, ending up on President Obama's list of favorite books of the year, how you balance your own emotions about this work.
Yeah. I mean, these are big questions. I feel like you and I should just, really take the show on the road because there's so much that I'd like to say to that. And I know that your work deals seriously with these kinds of double consciousnesses and the gratitudes mixed with, contaminated by intellectual awarenesses of, the occasion for gratitude being sort of doomed. Yeah, I mean, I came up in America, right? My dad really did work on poultry farms my whole life. He worked on duck farms though, so the book isn't autobiographical because in the book the dad works on chicken farms. But uh uh and yeah, I mean, he would always say, he worked 6 days a week and would wake up at 4:30 to go to the farm. And he would always say, in Iran, making this sort of money, we could be sultans, we could be kings, but we came here for you guys, meaning me and my brother, right? And so like the responsibility of that, right? Like that, my dad was working this hard, 6 days a week on doing manual labor on a farm, so that I could be an American, right? And there is inescapably, there is a gratitude that I feel towards my dad, and what he wants me to feel is, there's nothing that he would like more than for me to feel fully American, right? His favorite restaurant is KFC. He likes going to Long John Silver. He's like one of those sort of assimilationists, right? And so I don't know. I mean, like, it's saying that I'm ungrateful for, but there's that sense, right? That ubiquitous sense of like, aren't you glad to be here and not there? And I think that one of the main projects of my art writ large, not just this book, is to say that it's the same shit. You know what I mean? Like, it's the same, there it's a necrotheocracy, in Islam drag. Here it's necrotheocracy in capitalist drag. You know what I mean? Like, this one has like the sort of like more secular trappings, right? Like it is not using the rhetoric of Abrahamic religion, but it is still, they're sacrificing life for their capitalist god, right? That is the divine, right? And you see what's happening in Gaza, you see what's happening in Sudan, like you see what's happening here on our own soil, right? All of these are manifestations of that same thing, right? Women's rights eroding, right? Like, they show images and horror stories about what's happening in Iran, which is horrible, right? But they're also eroding women's rights here in this country, right? And so I think that one of the things that I would like to do is to say, like, it's not like here is this like beautiful utopian vision, and there is like the cesspool, right? Like, there is, again, like a necrotheocracy, largely installed by our meddling and intervention and European meddling and intervention. And yeah, how like people are obsessed with those, like, look at Iranian flight attendants from like 1975, or and they're wearing these mini skirts and stuff, and it's like the tacit implication is that the inexorable march of Persian people is towards barbarism. Like, even though they're capable of this, like, they will inevitably end up, and it's like it completely elides, the what the UK and the US did, right? And to foment, you understand what I'm saying. Sorry, I don't mean to go off on a whole tangent here, but Yeah, I mean, the project is to say, everyone is, there's no one has clean hands, right? We're all damned and we're all doomed. What do we do about it, right? Like, how do
Well,
yeah.
and I am going to get some of you submitted questions, and I will get to them, but you keep saying things that bring up questions I had. So you just said we're all doomed. I found your book so hopeful. There's one point in the book where you write, everyone she knew in Iran was cynical, believing hope was ignorant, even murderously naive. But I found that your book, which deals with such heavy themes, to be so full of hope, humor, connection. And I'm curious, given the themes you're exploring and the fact that you just say we're all doomed, how you write something so hopeful. And even the title, Martyr, I mean, it has an exclamation point at the end. You're doing things with the heaviness to transform them into something else.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I hope that it's not just pure nihilism and cynicism. I mean, that's not how I felt, and it's not how I feel, right? I think that we can talk about the exclamation point. I mean, the title of the book is Martyr, right, with an exclamation point. And the a martyr's death is very exclamatory. A martyr's death is it's the staccato burst that like superimposes meaning upon everything leading up to that death, right? Whereas the vast majority of us in this life live very, we accrue meaning, right? The man working on a duck farm for 30 years so that he can, send his kids to American college and they can get addicted to drugs and write poems or whatever, or like the second grade teacher who, works 60-hour weeks and, grades kids' papers who may or may not read them and, just constructs meaning day by day by day by day by day. You know what I mean? Like the vast majority of us have this kind of rolling ellipses of how we create a meaningful life, right? It's not a big staccato burst of sudden action, right? And that's the journey that Cyrus is on, right? He's very enamored of the ease of, like if I just, hurl myself in front of a tank that's rolling down the street, right? Suddenly my life was meaningful, right? But for the vast majority of, if I, Kaveh Akbar, am waiting for a tank to roll down my street here in Iowa City, I'm going to be waiting a while, right? And I'm not going to be, and if all I'm doing is sitting on my hands waiting, I'm not going to be helping anyone while I wait, right? I talk about this in the book a little bit, but I have always been a little caught up in these ideas of Abrahamic morality sort of governed by the 10 Commandments, and 8 of the 10 Commandments are about what thou shalt not do, right? The 2 Lucy's are honor thy parents and honor the Sabbath, which, some people have bad parents and the Sabbath shit, you know what I mean? Like they're kind of throwaway commandments. And I'm really on what throwaway commandments, but and then the rest are about what you shouldn't do, right? And I think you can not do any of that stuff. Like I can not kill and not adulterer and not steal today and still not actually do anything to help anyone, right? And I'm attracted to, and Cyrus is, I think, attracted to a kind of ethics founded in action, right? Founded in, actually doing things for humanity. And I think that's where the book ends, right? Is Cyrus realizes that, well, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale too hard, but yeah, I think Cyrus realizes that there are alternative paths to creating meaning.
Right. And I want to skip right from that to creating. You use the word creating, and so much of the book is about creation. I mean, you talk about a new way to be a martyr, and Orchidée is turning death into art. One thing I also just loved about your book is how littered it was with cultural references. I actually noted it that even just in the first pages, you've got references to Virginia Woolf, Jean Napoleon, and Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
And then, which I just loved. And then keep going, and you've got like Borges to Batman to Kurt Cobain to Nick Cave to Madonna to like so many of my favorite, Clarice Lispector, who bookends the book, who I'm obsessed with.
Yeah, me too.
you introduced me to new work like Miserere, which I never listened to, and I'm probably
Oh,
mispronouncing.
that's amazing. Yeah.
I'd never heard it. I can't stop listening to it. But you know, and you say one thing in the book where you say his whole life had been a steady procession of him passionately loving what other people merely liked and struggling, mostly failing to translate to anyone else how and why everything mattered so much. And I was kind of wondering with all these references if it's your way of making others see why the things you love so much matter.
Yeah. Oh, 100,000. I'm getting goosebumps that you're saying that. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, 100,000%. I mean, you know, you read Ulysses, and part of the thrill of reading Ulysses is just all these references that you don't understand, and just like knowing that there's all of these worlds yet to explore. You know, the thrill of becoming aware that you haven't felt all there is yet to feel, you know? And I love that. I love that feeling when I'm reading. I love that feeling and when I'm watching a movie or when I'm listening to music, you know, when something just feels like it's, you know, so ALLUSIVE, elusive, that it's like in conversation with this whole cosmos of, you know, and it's just like sort of whispering into a conversation that it sees traveling millennia in both directions, you know. I love that, and it's the only way that I can, you know. Borges, you mentioned Borges, and he's one of my favorite, right, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, and he said Kafka influenced Cervantes, which I always love because Kafka's much younger than Cervantes, right? But after Borges read Kafka, he could never read Cervantes the same way, right? And you know, for me, like Daï-Jean Napoleon, right, is like that influenced the way that I read Woolf, right? That influenced the way that I read Henry James, and that, you know what I mean? When I read, you know, and those like the, you know, there's a thing in the TV show from Michael Napoleon where he's like, between death and me, it's like this, right? You know, like with this with the fingers, and that's something that in the book I think Ali does. And there's no like, it's not explained as anything, but you know, like if you've seen the TV show, which a lot of us have, right? You know that when he does this, he's like, oh, that's like a thing from the show, you know, and just like little, you know, the idea that there are worlds here outside of just the words that I'm putting down on the page, right? Like that these characters live in a world where they read Virginia Woolf, and they, you know, and they know about the Safavid explorers, and they know about W.B. Du Bois, you know, and the implication of, you know, like in playwriting, right? Like you can have the sort of play where you know, if it's a dinner scene, you know, every table setting is made up with like a fork and a knife and a spoon and doilies and cups or whatever. Or you can have a dinner scene where there's a pitcher on the table, and that implies that you know, that they're in a kitchen, right? Or that they're in a dining room, right? And I like the way that, you know, a single Woolf book sitting on the table or a single reference to Sonic Youth or whatever implies that all these other things are also in this world, right?
Well, and you do it in some cases, you name your influences, you know, you have a whole scene with Rumi or a whole scene, you know,
Right.
but then you also have imagery. I mean, my brilliant cousin Lila, who I think is here, unseen, pointed out to me that the very last image of Cyrus's final chapter before we have Sang's chapter is referencing the image of Golo Bulbul from Persian poetry. I don't know if that
Oh, sure. Yeah. It took me
so
to understand which image was the, yeah.
So it's the image of the birds and the blossoms,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
apparently, and this is something I didn't know, but then I was so it led me to, and this is what I love about your book, is I think it'll lead a lot of people to go and research. If they haven't read Borges, they might go read it. If they don't know the history of Persian poetry, they likely will go back and read it. But that image is really about the lover and the beloved, the bird and the blossom, the lover and the beloved, the poet and beauty. And I thought that was such a kind of powerful image to end on for Cyrus. I love that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, again, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale too hard, but my read of that ending is about the salvific power of individual love, right? About the salvific power. I mean that both like literally, like in our physiological, you know, corporeal world, and also like psychospiritually, right? It something unlocks in that final, right? And but I mean, like, you know, like there's nerdy stuff like that I mean, like
Well,
the chapter where Arash is urinating on his sister Roya. There's a famous story about Mandana, maybe some people know about, and her enuresis, and like she has a dream in which urine like floods the kingdom. Like there's so much like just like truly you don't need to know it in order to enjoy the book, but then like if you really want to be a nerd about stuff, like hopefully the book holds up when you sort of roll up your sleeves like that too.
I love that. Well, one question about that, I didn't know if it was intentional, but so much of the book is also literally about language. I mean, you say,
Oh, 100%. Every
I've heard,
character
right.
soliloquizes about it.
Yes, they soliloquize about language. They say, I've heard people, one of my favorite lines was, I've heard people say smell is the sense most attached to memory, but for me, it's always language. But specifically, when I ended the book, and I just really love the character of Z and that relationship, and then I realized Z is the last letter of the alphabet. And I was wondering if that was an intentional choice, if it's like, in some way, he represents that unconditional love has to exist beyond language. And I
Yeah,
don't, was that intentional that his name is Z, or?
of course. Yeah, I mean,
Well, I don't.
Yeah, his name, like it's introduced earlier in the book is Zbigniew, which is like the first name of Zbigniew Herbert, who's like a post-war Polish poet that I like. But I also, you know, was sort of going through the catalog of, you know, people that I love who have Z names and what would be a good Z name, you know, for a character like that. And, you know, the Alpha and Omega seemed a little on the nose, but yeah, I mean, the book ends with, I mean, I guess the coda doesn't necessarily end with him, but him arriving in that final scene is what crumbles the world, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to language, and some people had this question, just curious, do you speak the Persian language? What is your experience of kind of, you reference so many poets and you're a poet yourself. Do you, there's so much controversy around some of the translations of our Persian poets and how accurate they are. Are you able to read the original?
Yeah, so my first language was Farsi, Persian, but when we came to America, I was just a little kid, and then my parents banned speaking it in the house because my brother, 7 years older than me, was really struggling in school, and so they thought it would hasten his English language acquisition. So consequentially, my Farsi atrophied, right? And so I don't speak it. I don't speak it well at all. I understand it okay, and I read it better than I understand it. So um I can read poems with a dictionary at my side, or like with someone helping me, you know, with the trot, or with accommodating, you know, if I'm reading Rumi or Hafez, that's a lot harder for me.
Yeah.
But people like Farrokhzad, you know, if I have a dictionary by my side, I can sort of like plug my way through it. I'm getting better. It's something that you know, I'll never be able to go back to Iran in this lifetime. So, you know, I can only work with a tutor and, you know, like flashcards and stuff like that. So it's slow going, but there's no rush really.
That is very impressive, though. Okay, many people want to ask about how personal the book is and what inspired it. So I'll just, Nina, I'm just going to shout some of you out because I appreciate the questions. Nina Abbasi wrote what inspired the book. Behzad Farhadpur asked what inspired the book. Diba Namju asked how personal the book is. Noor Fatima asked how much of Cyrus is reflected in yourself. There's obviously a lot of interest in the seed of inspiration and how much of it is autobiographical.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming through and for asking questions. I don't want to I always feel a little weird being like getting into the forensics of like this part actually happened and this part was, you know, but I mean, obviously Cyrus is fairly me adjacent. You know, he was born in Iran. He came to America. He is a poet. He's an addict, alcoholic. Like all of this is very public knowledge about me personally. So there are a lot of sort of superficial symmetries there, but I also feel strongly that Z and Orkideh and Ali and Arash are saying things that I firmly believe in. Gabe, the sponsor, you know, like there are all these characters that are also me. You know what I mean? One of the great things that I love about narrative art, like fiction or movies or screenwriting or plays, is that you can kind of put your hands in the sock puppets and make, you know, fight with yourself, right? You know, like you can, you know, I think the pathologization of cognitive dissonance in the 20th century has led to a lot of hollow seeming performances of certainty in the 21st century, which is to say, I mean, like the idiom of social media is like, I feel this monolithic eclipsing emotion right now, whether it's ecstasy or outrage or whatever. And it, and like, if that is how anyone's brains work, it's certainly not how mine work. You know, my brain is always like concurrent. Like right now, sitting here, I'm having a lovely conversation with my new friend Abdi, and I'm aware that, you know, a bunch of people are watching who I can't see, and I'm aware that, you know, at some point in the next hour, I'll probably need to use the bathroom. And I'm aware that like my dog needs to be walked. And I'm aware that right now, this second, there are people starving in Gaza. And I'm aware that my spouse is going to come home in the next hour and we need to walk the dog together when they get home. You know what I mean? Like all of these things, it's not in sequence, right? Like it's arriving on the same neural charge, right? And the crisis of language is that it can only put things in sequence. Like grammatical language can only happen sequentially. And so, gosh, I've sort of spun out from the actual question, but I say this to say, I appreciate narrative art for its ability to say, like, here are all the things at once, sort of, you know, I mean, and by at once, it's still over the, you know, 12 hours of you're reading the book or whatever, but it's a little more at once than social media or something like that.
Well, I have to say, I love the answer because it speaks to how your brain works and how the book weaves its spell. And it also, you don't think in a literal way. And so much of the book is about dreams as narrative as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, that one point in the book you write, it was hard for Cyrus not to see waking as the enemy, the way it corroded your power to exist, to live and think with acuity until you finally submitted. Being awake was a kind of poison and dream was the only antidote. I mean, these are the reason I keep quoting the book is it's so brilliant. It's so full of quotes you want to underline and just like put check marks next to the page. But you know, you use these dream sequences in the book that are so memorable where characters from Cyrus's life are interacting with Lisa Simpson or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Rumi. You know, you have it almost feels like prophetic. You know, it's about prophecy, and it reminded me a little bit of one of the works of art that changed my life the most, which was Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which uses similar style. And you know, I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you came to use these dreams in the narrative. And we also had a question that I'll ask about this from Sara Saedi, who I know personally was a great Iranian writer herself, who asked if there were any dream pairings that didn't make it into the book.
Oh, there's so many dreams. I mean, the dream pairings were thrilling to write. I mean, this book could have been 1,000 pages, literally. Like I write a ton and I publish very little. There are a ton of dream pairings that didn't make it into the book. Yeah, I mean, like I'm aware that, you know, I have 57 degrees in English. Like I'm aware that you're not supposed to put dream sequences in a work of literary fiction. Like it's not, sometimes I will give a reading and it's like people are like, does he know? You know, like I'm abundantly aware, right? Like that this is, you know, that people roll their eyes when you start talking about your dreams or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, like when I wake up in the morning, I ask my spouse if they've dreamt, because if they have, I get to spend the first 5 minutes of my day with my best friend telling me a story. You know what I mean? Like it's the best thing. You spend a third of your life with your brain, like putting on these productions, cast with like all the people that you've ever known that are like touching and inflected by your life in all of these like really, really circuitous, esoteric ways. And like, we're not supposed to talk about that. Like that's a third of our lives. And we're just not, I mean, I really think I'm right on this one. Like, I think that the world is wrong. Like, I think that dreams are interesting and that we should be talking about them all the time. That said, narratively, I understood that, you know, the reader would A, roll their eyes when they first encountered it, and B, you know, may skip past them if they didn't perceive them to be important, right? And so I studied things like Angels in America, like The Sopranos, like, you know, texts that take dreams really seriously, you know, and I mean, like, I don't mean to be, you know, like my brain doesn't just think in like Proust and Mozart, you know, like The Sopranos is like profoundly influenced the way that I think about art, right? And there's an episode where, Sopranos spoilers, sorry, where Tony is like trying to figure out who the snitch is in his inner circle or whatever, and he has a dream in which he's at like a fish market, and one of the fish is like, Big Pussy is the rat, right? And then he acts on that in his living, and it turns out Big Pussy was the rat, right? And they, you know, kill him or whatever. And so the dream sort of earns its place by delivering actual important narrative details. You know what I mean? Like his dream life is going out a little bit ahead of him, a little bit ahead of his consciousness. And this, you know, while, you know, Lisa Simpson talks to Roya, they're going out a little bit ahead of Cyrus's understanding of the sort of central mysteries of the novel, right? By the time you get to Rumi talking to Cyrus's dead dad, they're really naming some things in that conversation that Cyrus is not yet consciously aware of, but that he obviously, his unconscious has gotten a few beats out ahead of him. So like they're light and silly and strange scenes, but there's also something happening in terms of like the central actual narrative, right? Which is thrilling to me, right? And so, but I understood too that, you know, if I put 8 of those in there, right, it would be hard to keep that sort of tension going, right? So there are, I think, yeah, I used a pretty gentle touch. Actually, I did put the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar one. When I sold the novel, I had taken that out, and my editor made me put it back in, which was shocking to me because I assumed that everyone would make me take all of them out. And
Wow,
yeah.
that's so interesting. And I just want to say I appreciate personally, as somebody who was an English major and loves reading difficult novels, but also loves pop culture, that you are as influenced by, you know, Kafka and Borges as you are by The Sopranos, and
and
that's so part of what this novel, when I got to the big plot twist, I mean, this is a book club, so I assume you've all read it, but you know, I won't give it away. But I just love that you're not above a big plot twist, that you're you're telling a story, or it really just felt so satisfying in that way. And I appreciate that. We do have a few questions.
Oh, sorry. Just super quickly on that. I mean, like I was reading, like as I was writing this book, I was reading really promiscuously, and I read as much like Agatha Christie and like, you know, like Cheever, you know, like these really kind of like pulpy mystery, because I really wanted that part too. Like I think that for me, the art is in doing the like pinky in the air, you know, Borges, Cervantes referencing sort of thing, while also telling an interesting, propulsive story. You know what I mean? Not just like having, you know, these gnomic oracles, you know, waxing and soliloquizing in bon mots to each other, but actually like having stuff happen and having mystery, you know what I mean? Like
you succeeded. Yeah, it's a yarn. I mean, someone described one of my books as a yarn once, and I took it as a compliment. I love that word. It's a yarn. Like I had to turn the pages, and you satisfied my desire for the story to shift and to go places, never exactly where I thought it was going to go, always challenging my assumptions.
Immensely gratifying. That's immensely gratifying. Thank
you. This is a conversation primarily for Iranians. There are 2 themes that you discuss, addiction and sexuality, that I want to touch on. Let's start with sexuality because we have some questions here about that. I'm going to try and find them. We're getting a lot of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for all the questions. But, you know, we had somebody, I'll find the one that someone asked in advance, say, talk about, let's see, about basically the question is about why you chose to include queerness in the book, why it was necessary. So this, Sharare Moadeli asked why a female same-sex relationship was necessary for the story. I also just want to ask you myself, as a very, very openly gay Iranian who was talking about it before it was very comfortable. You know, what conversations you hope this book will inspire our community specifically to have around
Yeah.
queerness?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm breaking news to anyone that our community can be pretty regressive around issues of, and not just the community over there, but still the community, the diasporic community can still be pretty regressive where it comes to LGBTQ issues. And I also wanted, I mean, like your YA writing matters so much to people because it shows queer characters in life where, you know, the crisis of their being isn't always their queerness. You know what I mean? Like they're living life, right? And I'm interested in that kind of writing too, where, you know, this is not a book. I mean, like across the Iranian axis, across the Persian axis, right? This is not a book where, you know, I'm cutting pomegranates open and making fesenjoon and, you know, and talking about the revolution all the time. You know what I mean? And neither is it across the queerness axis, a book that endlessly reprocesses the, you know, the queerness is not a source of existential angst for the characters. You know what I mean? Like that is not an existential crisis for them. I mean, like there is a prominent, I mean, it gets a little spoilery to talk about, but there's a prominent queer relationship between two females in the book. And also, you know, Cyrus is just sort of like ambivalently sleeping with people, which is, you know, again, I don't want to get too autobiographical, but like my experience of life on the planet Earth has not been like I am locked into this like loadout of genitals and I'm only allowed to be attracted to you if what, you know what I mean? Like I'm just, I don't know, if you have a library card, I'll probably be pretty into you. You know what I mean? And like and I wanted a character who is like tormented by just about everything else, but that is not a particularly, you know, that's not a site of existential angst for him, you know, and that feels refreshing and powerful to me too. You know, one of my favorite novelists is the Nigerian novelist Amos Tutuola, who was a contemporary of Chinua Achebe. And while Achebe was, you know, writing these incredible crystalline sentences that could be hung in a museum next to Nabokov or Woolf or Morrison or, you know, Yeats, right? Like just truly took this European form and like conquered it, right? He did. Tutuola sort of goes the other way, and his, you know, his sentences are really strange and the grammar is always a little off and broken. And you know, his most famous book is called The Palm Wine Drinkard. Even in the title, it's not Palm Wine Drunkard, it's Palm Wine Drinkard, right? Like there's something just always a little bit off about his constructions. And when he wrote his work, the Nigerian literary establishment was all kind of like, we know how to speak English. We don't sound like that, right? Like that's not how we talk. Because again, like his English is very sort of his own, and his storytelling is not, you know, marked by novel conventions, right? You know, it's much more sort of Yoruba storytelling, but strange. I mean, it's very, very weird. And he was like, I know, like, this is how I want to talk, right? And he was just like utterly ambivalent about the European gay, right? Like while Achebe sort of like masters this European form, Tutuola is like indifferent to it, you know? And that's always seems so radical and cool to me, right? And there's something about that in the book's relationship to queerness too, right? Is like, I could show you like, you know, queer excellence and like, you know, these characters, you know, triumphing and loving themselves or whatever, or I can just be like indifferent, like show you characters who are just like like they're just like, I sleep with who I sleep, you know, I love who I love, right? And there's plenty of other stuff in my life to be anxious about, you know.
Right. Well, and one of those things might be addiction, which I had mentioned, and I want to talk.
Yeah, nice segue. That's beautiful.
I mean, I'm here for all the segues.
Yeah, that's good.
It's my job. But look, this is, I'm queer. I'm also someone like many queer people whose lives have been touched deeply by addiction. My first boyfriend died of an overdose. I've had many close friends leave us. because of addiction. I've also seen so many of my loved ones get sober. It's something that I find, again, in our community, some resistance to discussing openly, and your book does it so beautifully. And one of my favorite quotes, you say, "The iron law of sobriety, with apologies to Leo Tolstoy. The stories of addicts are all alike, but each person gets sober their own way." And I'm wondering if you were to say something to all the Iranians who are hearing this now and who will hear it when it's put online about how they can get sober their own way and how they can talk about addiction more openly, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know very many people in this life whose lives haven't been touched by it in one way or another, firsthand, secondhand. You have a brother, you have a son, you have a lover, you have an uncle, whatever, a daughter, whatever. I mean, it is ubiquitous and only getting ubiquitous or more ubiquitous. I, we're all goners till we aren't, I've been sober for 11 years. And I found a fellowship of people who work one day at a time to try to not die together. And that's available, that's available. And so are fellowships for people who, love people who are going through that. And people, I mean, it's a disease, it's like blaming yourself because your daughter has this disease is like blaming yourself because your daughter has diabetes, or blaming yourself because your daughter has whatever. I mean, it's absurd, right? But it can be really difficult to look on the suffering of someone that you love and feel no responsibility, right? And feel no call to intervention, right? There are people who have done it, though. There are people who do it every day, and there are resources, right? I mean, that is my life. Like, I work with, I mean, in spaces that I don't often talk about that stuff in spaces like this, but I sell books and run around and teach and stuff so that I can keep my dog in the expensive kibble from the vet that's good for his kidneys. You know what I mean? Like, my life is actually like working with people in recovery, and that's what gives my life meaning. And that work inflects every page of this novel.
No, that's beautiful. And for anyone listening, I also, I am not an addict, but I am a very proud member of Al-Anon who goes to meetings. As anyone touched by addiction, there's so many resources out there. I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, so I'm going to try and get to some of your questions. We haven't really talked about your poetry, which is so beautiful. I actually went on YouTube and listened to you deliver some of your poems, which is so beautiful. But we had a question from Cookie Hipponia, also a great writer herself. We have a lot of writers here who wanted to ask about how hard it was to write prose after writing poetry, and if there's one you prefer to write.
Definitely no preference. I mean, I'm still writing poems. I'm still writing prose. It's whatever comes out that day. I will say that poetry trained my ear and trains my ear. But what poetry didn't train was my ability. I mean, and that you've written a billion more books than I have, but the difficulty of just like getting characters through doorways to have conversations with each other, and explaining how a character got the money to get on an airplane, and explaining how, like, these things poetry didn't prepare me for at all. And I really had to study, and, when you read Morrison, one of the amazing things about Morrison is that, like, she's giving you this crystalline, extraordinary, poetic, lyrical prose. And within that, she's also giving you like the entire floor plan of the house, right? Like, I could, when you're reading Bluest Eye, you could map out Piccola Breedlove's house by, the fourth paragraph. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane. And it's like, you don't even recognize that she's doing it. But like, if you had a sheet of paper, you could be like, okay, well, that's where the hallway is, and that's where like that sort of stuff I had no sense of prior to trying to write a novel myself, right? I never saw those particular marionette strings, and I never saw, that craft. And now I look for it everywhere, in movies and in books and plays and every sort of narrative art. I see that in a whole new way.
I love that. We have to wrap up very soon.
Okay.
So I thank you to everybody who submitted questions. You're going to have a chance to be a part of the book club discussion. I want to just ask one fun final question you may not an answer to, but I was in the UK not long ago and I noticed how different the cover was there. So for anyone who doesn't know, we have the US cover here, which is an illustration inspired by Cyrus's uncle, which I wanted to ask you about. We didn't get to, but actually, since someone asked, I have to ask, is Cyrus's uncle, who everyone who's read the book will be haunted by this image forever of him as this angel of death, is that something that came from research or something that came from your imagination? And then I'll ask my final question.
It came from research. It's not something that would ever exist in any official capacity, but it existed in the stories that multiple people who served in the Iranian army during the Iran-Iraq War told me. Independently of each other, told me about these rioters. Again, I'll never be able, obviously the Iranian government will never be like, oh yeah, no, that totally happened, and so who knows? But apocryphally, from independent sources, those writers did exist.
It's such a powerful.
Yeah. I could spend the rest of my life just writing about Arash, the uncle. Absolutely.
And we had questions, and I had so many questions I didn't get to ask you about Bobby Sands and Iyer, the connection between Iran and Ireland, which I could discuss. Oh, I so wanted to discuss.
There still is a Bobby Sands street in Tehran. Some of the people here might.
So I didn't know that. I had a conversation with some Middle Eastern friends who are all artists not long ago, and we realized we were all obsessed with Irish literature.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels.
There's a lot of parallels. I didn't even know about the Bobby Sands street until your book. But let's just this fun last question, because we're gonna have to let you go so we can have our book club. So this is the US cover, which is this image of Uncle Arash, but it's turned into something very like tragicomic in a way.
Yeah, it's kind of cheeky.
Right. And in the UK, the cover is a black and white. Oh, they pulled it up. So this is the UK cover, which is this very pensive black and white image of a female figure that I have to assume is Orchidée. Or meant to be Orchidée. And my question is, if this book could have an Iranian edition, what do you think the cover should and would be?
I mean, that's impossible. I don't know. I mean, like the idea of this book, my first book came out in Iran, but my first book was an addiction recovery narrative. So every time it mentioned alcohol, it got elided, it got changed. And so it's like just a book of nonsense. It's almost like an art project in censorship, because it's just a book that makes no sense, a book about addiction in which every reference to addiction is taken out, So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I love the sort of like this little rider, I love that rider. I think it's so good.
Oh, by the way, mine is different because it says New York Times bestseller.
I can always tell like which edition someone has like an early edition or later edition by that. Yeah, so I do think it's interesting that the US copy all orbits Cyrus as the main character, and if you read that UK copy, it mostly orbits the artist Orchidée as being like this sort of central figure who has these, and the book started, the earliest drafts of the book were conversations with the artist Orchidée in her exhibit, and then just like random people sitting across from her, and the whole book was just going to be this sort of like Tuesdays with Maury thing where people just sat across from her and she would be this like oracular font of wisdom, and there would be these ciphers sat across from her, and I quickly realized that wouldn't be very narratively interesting, and realized that the person sat across from her had to be as interesting as she was, right? But really in the book's like earliest proto draft, she is the main character, right? And then Cyrus sort of arrived as a solution to a problem, narratively, right? And now obviously most of the word count goes to Cyrus, but so there's something I think pure about that British cover too.
I love that. Thank you for sharing all that with us. And we didn't get to talk much about Orchidée. I know there was a question about her. We can discuss her more. How Marina Abramovich she is. I went to that visual.
You went to that? You saw
I
that?
did. Yeah, I
Oh,
did.
that's so cool.
I did.
That's
And
so
in the minute I met Orchidea, I was like, oh my God, it must be inspired by
100%.
it.
Her gallerist teases her about, she's like, the artist is present and she's dying in the end of the book.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Also, of all the cultural references you've given us, Tuesdays with Morrie is the most surprising. Thank you.
Yeah, listen, it all goes into the chunky.
It all goes in. So we have to let you go. I know we have a lot of hands up. So once Kaveh leaves us, we will still keep this discussion going to discuss the book. This is a book I could ask you a million more questions, and I know everyone's going to have so much to say.
In the fullness of time, we'll be able to.
Yeah, but just I think on behalf of everybody who's here and on behalf of the whole Iranian community, thank you for writing this book. It's so beautiful. It speaks to so many issues that we think about constantly. I think all of us probably see little bits of ourselves in it, and it's created community. So thank you.
Thank you both for the gift of your time and the gift of your attention.
Yes, thank you so much. Abdi said it best, so I have no more words, but we are so delighted to be able to celebrate this great book and celebrate you here, and we are delighted to have you here today. So thank you, Kaveh.
Thank you, everybody.
So now we will open the discussion to you, the audience members. So I'm going to invite some of you to join us slowly. And you just have to accept our invitation.
Cookie! Oh.
And just start speaking and
Cookie,
people join us.
Take it away, Cookie.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I haven't actually, so I was like 40 pages away from finishing. But that's because, like, look at this. I ran out of post-it notes and I had to like go to purple. Because like you said, there's so many passages and so many phrases in this book that I'm like, listen, I gotta fight Kaveh after school because this is way too good. Like I was like mad, like, oh, this is so good. I don't know. I mean, like that's like I think there's so much about the discussion of your legacy, right? About like what you hope will outlive you. And I don't know, maybe we could start with that because I think that sort of in the Q&A I asked like what if he could pick out like a passage from the book, like what his central thesis was. And I feel like, you know, sort of with the title and like martyr, right? Like how can you make your death more meaningful? By making your life more meaningful, right? And so like Cyrus is like obsessed with that a bit, I think.
Yeah, well, if I can, you know, I'm already seeing some faces here, and the beauty of the Iranian community is some of us know each other. I know there's faces on screen who are writers, faces who are curators, faces who are queer activists. If anyone wants to speak about how this book made them think about what it is to be Iranian right now and what we do want our legacy to be, raise your hand, come on screen, and let's talk about that. I see a hand from Diba, but Adia is in charge of.
They can start. They just need to unmute themselves.
Hi, Salam. We just wanted to say, we actually just very interestingly just kind of want to talk about even how we got to read this book. So my sister and I are both Irani, and we were in Central Park just walking, and my sister had been saying that she wanted to read a book, that she, you know, we were with family. And she was just like, oh, I wish that
I kept having a desire to read a book because everyone was reading a book in Central Park. So I wanted to be one of them. We're walking down. We run into a book and we're like, oh, this is like so cool. What is this?
Like we found a book on a bench randomly. And there was no cover or anything. It was like a navy blank cover and which is with the title Martyr on the side.
And then
my sister opens like the book because we were just curious to see what it was. And she read the name Cyrus, and we were like, "Oh my God, it's Irani, like boy, we were both so intrigued."
And we grabbed the book and
we essentially grabbed the book, and I ended up reading it first, and then my sister, and we both fell in love with it. But like, even the fact of like, that it just basically landed in front of us and we read like, and all of us, that you guys know, like we read such an amazing book. Like I wanted Kaveh to know that so bad that like, we just found this book and like now that we're both done with it, we're planning on like putting it back on that bench so that somebody else can like pick that
Okay,
book
but
up.
to answer
Oh,
your
that's like-
question,
Yeah.
as like young Iranian women, we want to go back to Iran very badly. Like we want to visit our country so bad. We have like Mother Bozorgam, like my whole family's there. I want to see them, but right now it's dangerous for us to go because like there's such a, I guess there's such a hatred towards women. Like they don't want women to be free. We're just too good. But point is, this book made us realize that Iranians, like Orkidea has her own dream. She could have not gone on the plane, or she could have, called Cyrus back, hey, I'm still alive. But she decided to, go out and live her own life in New York and leave her family behind. But we Iranians, like, we don't leave each other behind. Our dream is a community that looks out for each other. And I can tell this community is one of those. So I think, what about you?
But I mean, just overall, like everything that, I mean, even that you guys had mentioned when you were talking with Kaveh about what it meant to him to write that book.
The meaningful life. What it means to live a meaningful life is helping others who are going through recovery. That made his book feel even more real.
Yeah.
Like you said, we see a piece of ourselves. I saw a piece
Like a
of
lot of the
myself in that
content,
book.
we felt like even just being like a little younger, like we definitely could relate to.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot of the language was very easy for us to like comprehend
Digest.
and like digest.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, sorry, we just wanted to share our
yeah.
story. 'Cause
No,
overall,
and I'll
yeah.
keep, I think what I'll keep doing, as you guys say such wonderful things, is just keep shifting little things of what you say to lead the conversation. To me, what's so interesting about some of what you're saying is, as Iranians, we're so focused on the politics of Iran. And I think what's so beautiful about this is finally we're focused on art, and art brings people together, in my opinion. Politics generally divides. I'm curious what other people feel like. What was the emotional experience of reading a book, being a part of this community where, as Iranians, we're not focused on a government or that government. We're focused on a work of art and emotional experience. I see a hand. Sarah.
I just wanted to say I'm curious if anyone else had this experience, but I felt like being Iranian American, having moved to the States when I was 2 years old, like reading the book oftentimes validated my Iranianness to myself. Like, oh, this resonates with me. Like when he writes about Taro, for these things that are so like part of my DNA, part of my everyday life. And then there's moments where it brought out my guilt of not being Iranian enough. Like, why wasn't this plane crash that was such a significant thing that happened more top of mind in my life? Like I was a child when it happened, but I should have more recall than I do of it. Like I don't know enough about the Shahnameh, like things like that. It's always like a little bit validating and confronting at the same time. And oftentimes I realize like the idea of imposter syndrome I apply to my career, but that I realize I'm like, I have a lot of cultural imposter syndrome too within the Iranian community sometimes. And I wonder if anyone else experiences that, if I'm the only one, but there's that kind of constant feeling of joy, validation, and then also a little bit of guilt, like I'm not Iranian enough.
I feel that all the time. And I also always have felt like if I am Iranian enough, I'm still it's the wrong kind of Iranian enough. It's like in every space you're being challenged by being the right kind of Iranian. And it's a very hard thing. It's that, okay, we have so many hands. I think Ocean, I'd seen your hand first. So.
Yeah, and thank you so much for holding this space. I think it's so necessary right now for all of us to be joining in a space like this. So thank you first. I think the first thing we talked about was dual consciousness. And I think that kind of speaks to what we're all talking about is that, and what you said, Sarah, is that like, you're not Iranian enough, and I think that you are Iranian enough, and there is no such thing as like Iranian enough. And I think that like for me, like Abdi, you're one of the first Iranian people I've ever read a book by, and especially a queer Iranian writer, and to be seen like that is so special. And then this is like the second author I've read a book by, and to be seen again is so special. And like I was seen so many times in this book, felt so amazing. And like the idea of the dual consciousness, like kind of affirms that, like that we see ourselves through other people's eyes, and that like we like believe that like over and over and over again, and then we're like, we're not enough, we're not enough, we're not enough. But then we get into spaces like this, and then we're like, wait, other people see that too, or like other people believe that, but it's like we are enough. Like other people are feeling that too. And like I think we're robbed of that in our culture so much, because like we see ourselves through these other people's eyes for so long, because that's like what we're told for so many years of our lives. And like I think because of politics, we've been told to believe that we're not allowed to be like proud of ourselves. And like I grew up during like 9/11, so like I was told that I wasn't allowed to like be proud to be Iranian. So I didn't know about this plane crash. Like I was too young to know. Like I wasn't born in a time where I knew about this. So when I read this, I was like, did this actually happen? Like, is this something that I just didn't know about? And so I did some research about that. And like I was like, oh, like this is actually something that happened. Like I was robbed of this history. And it wasn't until like 2020 when I actually had like space to learn about history on my own, and I had that like space for myself to like dive into this stuff, that I started to like really dive into my culture and space away from my family, to be honest, that I wasn't being like told to believe who I was. And I'm a trans man, so like I had to do a lot of like shifting away from like who I was told to be, and like socialization as like a woman, from my family. So like I've done a lot of like differentiation from being Iranian, from being from my family. So like as that, like I've had to do a lot of unlearning from my culture and from my family upbringing. And with that, like I've had to do a lot of relearning of who I want to be and who I actually am, and like what my heart is. And like in as a queer person, there's a lot of like unlearning and relearning, and like who am I? Like what are the like lessons that I want to like teach myself? And like it's a lot of that. And like I think as the dual consciousness, it's like I was writing this list of like, it's like there's like even more than dual consciousness. It's like there's like a whole list of like things that are even more than Iranian. Than like it's like you have this whole list of oppressions that you have to like see through other people's eyes as a queer person too. So it's like I don't even know. I like kind of like got this like whole
No,
thing.
Thank you, Ocean. I think it speaks to why we need to be having these conversations, and why books like these are so important. Also, why it's so important to have books written by people who have lived the experience. By for so long, stories about our part of the world weren't even told by Iranians. So that's probably why people didn't know about the plane crash or didn't know the real history. I mean, so often we're getting our own history from people who didn't live it and didn't experience it. I know for myself as a queer person, I've always felt very divided, like my gay self and my Iranian self. And I think a lot of that was because Western thought really taught me a certain kind of version of self-empowerment that equated with, if someone doesn't accept you just as you are, you have to shut the door on them. And there was very much like a a casting of my Iranianness as like this self that was holding me back, and I never wanted to let go of being Iranian. I think so much of what's beautiful about a book like Kaveh is about hopefully my own work is we're trying to unite. Art is uniting. It's bringing all this together. We're not letting go of our Iranianness, and we're not letting go of our queerness. We're putting it in the same stories and challenging people to see the humanity. And I think that's so much of what your heart is saying.
Yeah, exactly.
There were a lot of hands. Okay, Dina or Dana, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it.
Dana, thank you.
Dana.
I want to kind of circle back at this part in the book where Cyrus talks about the double consciousness and how much he's thinking about his audience as he's writing his book in the book, and how I'll just quote the book. It's hard not to think about what would a person who hates me think about this. And Orchidea says, why are you worried about what people who hate you think about your art? Well, because the people who hate me also own all the guns in the prisons. It's probably not a good practice to start imagining headlines about your art before you even make it. And I'm a writer. I'm working on my first novel, and it is something that I feel like arrested by, almost kind of the current climate of what is it like to create these characters in this world that I am building that is also going to be received by the outside world at some point. And in another conversation that Cyrus has with Orchidea, where he says, because I know my writing can never make any of these deaths matter the way they're supposed to. It will never arrest fascism in its tracks or save the planet. It will never bring my mother back. And so, like, I guess my question for like the writers in the room is, how do you create with that hanging over us? Because I feel like as writers of color, especially Iranian writers, queer Iranian writers, it can feel like there can be such a weight to what we create because of the lack of representation. So how do we create through that is really something I've been like kind of struggling with and sitting with these last couple of years in my novel.
Yeah, I don't know if there's one answer to that, and I know there's a lot of hands, so we'll get to it. I mean, what I would say to that as a writer, number one, is once you accept that you're going to write more than one thing, it relieves your own burden, because you're like, well, I may not get everything right in the first book, but I might do it in the next book, and then I'll get better and better, and by the next book and the next book. I think also something that Kaveh talked about that I was so moved by is just how he fills his books with everything he loves, all the things he's so passionate about that he wants people to understand. And when I was young, and I may be getting this wrong, but I remembered a quote from the artist John Cameron Mitchell, who said something along the lines of, if you put everything you love into your work, everyone will love it too. And so people always say that about my own books. They're always like, oh, there's so many references. I'm like, yeah, I just fill my books with everything I'm obsessed with. Like, I'm obsessed with Madonna, it's in my book. I'm obsessed with this, Rumi, he's in my books. I'm obsessed with Lana Del Rey. I'm writing a book about her, but it's all about communicating your passion. And sometimes that passion takes a form of anger, it takes a form of joy, but if it exists all in the same work, what you're showing people is your true experience. Okay, I'm gonna so many hands. Fariba, I think you were first. Let's go Fariba, Lila, Nilu, Cookie.
Yeah, I think, this conversation's gone in different directions now, but I want to take it back. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Abdi for doing such an amazing job moderating this whole thing. You are so smart. You read the book the way it was supposed to be read as a novelist, and you were able to ask him the most, probing questions. I would have asked him also, how long did it take you to write the book? I don't know how long it actually took him, because he said he talked about all the evolutions of the book and how it started out differently. Anyways, but going back again, thank you for starting the conversation with them about double consciousness. We keep coming back to that theme. And I found it, I've highlighted on my iPad all the beautiful passages. There's so many of them, but that one really stood out to me, even though, that idea of it really arose from W.E.B. Du Bois and, around racism. But even today, I think it's every immigrant story really revolves around or really dwells on this double consciousness. And some of it also delves into the ideas of shame and guilt and not knowing how to deal with the shame and guilt that are brought onto you. Somebody brought up the idea of self-doubt, and it's all part of our own personal experiences. And I think it's wonderful to read a book written by someone who has a different experience than my immigrant experience, because I'm in a different generation. I'm much, much older than everybody else. But nonetheless, I think we all share this same level of anxiety. We don't know which side of the fence to be on. Are we Iranian? Are we American? But reading something like this brings us all together, and then makes these young ladies who found the book on the bench wanting to go back to Iran, because it just brought out the best in their eating hendevane, which is very Iranian to do. Anyways, I'll just stop at that. But I just thank you for bringing up the whole idea of the double consciousness, because at the core of everything
It's
he's
yeah.
written. Mhm.
No, I wanted to say it's fascinating that so many of you also kind of pinpointed that double consciousness as an interesting piece for you, because it was what I wanted to start with. And I do think it speaks to the fact that as Iranians here in the West, we are coming to a new consciousness of who we are. When I read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, I thought a lot about like how the original Iranians who came here really tried to become part of the dominant caste and wanted to make themselves seem white. There's also a great book I'd like to shout out here for our community called Limits of Whiteness, Iranian Americans and the Everyday Politics of Race by Neda Maqbooleh, another book that's really exploring how we belong. I think Kaveh, in making that piece by Du Bois so crucial to his book, is saying we have more in common with marginalized Americans than we do with the dominant caste, and it's time for us to talk about that. I just love that you all resonated with that piece. Okay, Lila is next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Abdi, for this. Again, just echoing a lot of people have been saying it, if everybody can hear me well, because it's on my headphones. This kind of segues perfectly into a little bit about what I wanted to talk about as well. One of the passages that came up to me as we're discussing this idea of double consciousness is when Gabe and Cyrus have that fight, and Gabe calls him out and is kind of like, "Are you really Iranian? Like, how Iranian are you? I can't remember exactly the words, and I don't have the book in front of me right now, but it's a very powerful way. It's like, aren't you more American than you are Iranian? And he says it in a really powerful way that kind of echoes a lot of what everyone's saying. Like, are we not Iranian enough? Are we more Iranian? Who says that? Who gets to judge each other? And I don't know how. I assume many, obviously, many of us have been either born in Iran, came here, some can still go. I myself, I'm very privileged that I get to go and come back and, be in these both worlds. And I have also struggled with this in my own sense of being in Iran and always being the American, or the Canadian or whatever, the Westerner, there. And it really, I'm talking from a lot of different places, but something that it reminds me of is that, so our parents' generations who came here, who assimilated so well, they're really Iranian because they're the original immigrants. And in the end, even when I go back to Iran, I'm not those Iranians. I'm Iranian. I'm Iranian American, Iranian Canadian. Actually, I was born in Canada, so we're all over. But there is an experience in which, yes, we're Iranian American, and we're going to be able to, reflect back on what our culture is, create our Iranian American culture today, because our parents, they're not American. at all, even however much as they try to assimilate. And we're the first generation that are actually the trailblazers of what it means to be Iranian American. And we get to decide how inclusive we are. We get to decide if we still have to, abide by those immigrant kind of expectations of all going to Harvard and all becoming engineers, all that nonsense. And not always nonsense, but, it's because if you don't, as quoted from our family, if you don't go to Harvard, the next best thing is marrying someone who went to Harvard. So, I mean, sad and like dead, deceased. But in the end, yeah, I mean, just like, Abdi and many of us mentioned, as long as we're true to ourselves and, a few fights that I've had to have. I remember once getting my license in Iran, and the woman, my teacher, she was young, she was around my age, and she kind of was like, "You're not Iranian. You're not really Iranian." And I got so offended. I basically stopped the car. I yelled at her, and I was like, I am like 7 generations Iranian. I don't even know how many generations back. Like, what do you want? What do you want from me to be Iranian? I studied Iranian history in college. I take Persian language classes. Like, I don't know everything I do. I'm a curator. Every artist I work with is mostly either Middle Eastern or Iranian. Like, what do you want from us? How, and it kind of goes back to all this, that we are what we are and we're Iranian. And anyway, I'm going to end there, but lots to say. And that passage again was so telling about like, you're not Iranian, but I am Iranian. He feels Iranian anyway.
Yes, and I had actually underlined that passage too for another question about him that I didn't get to. So it is, I feel like a lot of us were focusing on the same passages. Okay, I know we're coming up on an hour and a half, so we have 2 more hands. We'll get to them and then we'll probably wrap up. Nilu and then Cookie.
Hello. It's so funny as I'm hearing all of you. So I'm not actually American. I've been here for 10 years. I'm still like in a student visa, but I don't feel Iranian a lot of the times when I'm back in Iran, when I'm back with other Iranians. And I loved this book when it came out. I read it in February. I've been evangelical about like getting everyone I knew to read it. And through my non-Iranian friends reading it, they were like, "Oh my God, we understand so many things about you and about this book because we knew you." Like the things of Tarov was like so interesting. My friend like sent it to me. "This is you every time we're going through a door and like you insist that someone else goes through," and like things like that. And so one of the things that like really kind of this book, there's a passage in it that Orkide says to Cyrus, "Oh, another Iranian man obsessed with death." How like cliche. Mm-hmm. And like I found that devastating because I felt that. Like I think this idea of having a death that's meaningful, it's something that a lot of us think about. And I think of I'm sorry. I am dealing with a recent death as well, both by suicide of a friend and like a cousin dying. But this idea of like having a death that's meaningful. And I think of like the generational trauma of like a lot of like not even us, but the people like our parents, our aunts, the people who went through the revolution, kids that grew up in the revolution, in the war. So like, so sorry. The kids that die in protest. Like I had a friend who died, like in '88, Iranian year, during those protests. Like things that like this kind of idea that there's a reason, why as a culture we're obsessed. We want our deaths to have meaning. And so I love this book so much. And I was so devastated by the end because in like great like Iranian narrative tradition, the ending is really open for you to decide what you want it to be. And I love that. A lot of the times I hate like Western narrative. They give you everything in a bow, like everything is tied up. And I really love the idea of this, that it's like up for you to decide. And I was devastated because the only thing I could feel authentically was that he either was dead or committed suicide or like something like that had happened, and this was the afterlife. And I found it devastating that this is the only thing I can interpret. And like my friends who would like, no, I choose to believe that this is like the happy ever after ending that they're getting. And the fact that this was, I could not understand then what was the meaning. Like I couldn't find the meaning in that suicide. And as a person, I believe that if someone is in so much pain, that it is their right to, they don't owe anything to anyone else because it brings the people who are left pain if they commit suicide. Like I actually, even having gone through a friend who committed suicide, I do believe that. And I found the end still so devastating. So I'm wondering, what is your reading, like some of your reading of like that ending, and how, I don't think this is like anything that anyone can answer, but how do we find death, meaning in death and life, and how do we try to have like a meaningful life and a meaningful death? Sorry to talk so much.
No, not at all. And I hope you look at the comments, because everybody is writing messages of support to you in there. And I want you to see them and feel them. I know sometimes as Iranians, just sharing emotions is something we weren't raised to do. Having these kinds of open discussions is not something we're used to. It's so beautiful to hear everyone's vulnerability. I think we've all been touched by death. I know I have, by suicide. I think the reason so many Iranians in this book resonates is because it is part of our history. I remember when our kids went to Farsi school here in the Valley in Los Angeles, all the parents had a initial lunch when we started, and we realized every single person had a family member who died in Iran because of politics, whether from one side or the other. It didn't even matter. It was about the emotional experience, and we were all there for each other. And I think we're all here for you right now, and for each other. And the one thing I just want to say, because I don't know that I can answer for Kaveh what he means by the ending, but people ask me this all the time, especially because I happen to write for young adults, and I do take on heavy themes, including Iranian history, including AIDS, queer life. The act of creation is an act of hope. To write a book is hopeful. To create a painting is hopeful. To make music is hopeful. You're literally taking all the emotion of life and turning into something that might help others and shine a light on people's common experiences. So that's, I always, when I put a book like this down that is dealing with so many big emotions, I always feel like, wow, the fact that this book even exists is an act of hope. You know. Okay, now we have more hands. I will let Cookie, you were next. So go next, and then we'll see when we wrap up.
Okay. So oh, I don't know. Did I mute my audio? No.
We hear you.
We can hear you.
Awesome. So there's a passage here, like kind of like wrapping up a bunch of the things that we talked about, of like double consciousness and feeling like you're kind of an outsider to everything. This passage right here really struck me. Also because Abdi, this is the whole, like, I'm obsessed with this. The series Interview with a Vampire. There's a question that somebody asks him in that, or somebody asks Louis, the central character, like, who are you when you're alone? Right. And so I feel like a lot of us who have grown up as immigrants or children of immigrants and are kind of in this, have this double consciousness, feel this way of like, and I'm just going to read this passage where he says that Cyrus felt like Blade, the Wesley Snipes hero, half human, half vampire, with all the superpowers of each species, like super strong, but also capable of walking around in sunlight. Like Blade, Cyrus was a day walker, American when it suited him and Iranian when it didn't. And I'm not Iranian, obviously, but I'm Filipina, and I immigrated when I was 9. And I've always felt that way of like, just, everybody, the people have said this too, of like, when I'm in a room full of Filipinos, I don't feel Filipino enough. But then when I'm in a room full of not Filipinos, then I'm still not enough of that, right? And so there is this, and Orchide in the book also says something like, the grace is like, how can I keep living after I've died? And she one of the central themes, I think, of the book too is about names, right? Like Orchide goes through, I'm Roya, I'm Layla, I'm Orchide. And a friend of a friend who's Iranian actually, like Kaveh talked about how seeing his very Iranian name on this book is in airports, right, is like huge. But this friend of a friend was looking to belong more in, I don't know, non-Iranian spaces by picking a name for himself that sounded less Iranian, but still was Iranian. And he chose Cameron, but with a K. And I was like, okay, but why would you do that? Why, like, but I feel like this is something that Roya in the book goes through of like, to belong elsewhere, to belong in the spaces where I want to belong, I'm going to change my name. And I'm just wondering, like how, like, what are people's experiences with that of like being in spaces where your name, right? Or people go, oh, is it Abdi or is it Abdi? How do you say your name? Right? Like, and it's so awkward because you're like, well, how do I make it easy for you? But also like resonant for me. And I know like Ocean, I have a trans goddaughter. And so she's sort of like, okay, I picked my name because I want to belong in this space. Right. And so like, but how much are we allowed to do that? How much grace are we given, right, to do that? I mean, my birth name is not Cookie, but I go by that. So, well, okay, I shouldn't say that because I've been called Cookie since birth, but that's not the name on my birth certificate, right? So like how much of that is like, how much of names and naming and like language is important to our belonging?
Well, I mean, we could talk, we can't go on.
I know.
I will say for myself, very similar to you, Abdi is not the name on my birth certificate. It was Abdul Reza. Everybody called me Abdi from when I was very young. And I thought I was Abdi. Like nobody ever called me Abdul Reza except when I was very, very, very young in like home videos, and so when it came time, as many immigrants, you're getting, document after document. When it came time to get a new passport, we put the name Abdi. And so now that's my legal name. I don't think anything about it. I think of it as a much easier Iranian name, obviously, than Abdul Reza. But still, when I moved to Hollywood and started my career as a screenwriter, one of the first things I was told was to change my name, which I refused to do.
Yeah.
And it's very important to me. I think another thing that Kaveh writes about and that we all, I think, feel as Iranians is a sense of real pride. Many immigrants feel this way. I want my name on my books. I want my family name to be seen, These are very big things. And the big things in the queer community too, where there's so much double consciousness. Ooh, okay. I also want to say to you, Cookie, and then we're going to go to Mernaz, and we'll try and get to everyone who has a hand raised. So Mernaz, then Ocean, that I appreciate you being here as a non-Iranian. I know as myself, having so many friends, I've always had, and my best friend was over yesterday, and her and her wife are both, one is full Filipino, one is part Filipina. So many of my best friends from childhood were Sri Lankan, Indian, different immigrant. And because I think growing up in the West, we had a common bond as kids from immigrant families. It's just nice to see one face here. I think the only one who's not Iranian, finding those points of identification, and we all appreciate you.
Yeah, and I appreciate all of you. I mean, like seriously, like for allowing me to be in this space, right, and talking about, how universal this is. That it's like we're not alone, right? We all have been in these spaces where we don't feel like we belong. I mean, that's the literal title of my book. We belong, right? It's like we are always trying to belong elsewhere, like where we're not. But anyway.
Okay, Mernaz, then Ocean.
Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Abdi, for, facilitating this and giving us a space to discuss. I wasn't intending on speaking. I kind of just wanted to be here and listen. And that's partly because, everyone kind of talked about struggles with identity and cultural identity of not feeling, 100% American and not feeling 100% Iranian. And I also struggle with that. But I was born in the United States. And so I kind of relate more to the American identity than the Iranian one. I graduated UCLA with an English degree. I studied English literature, and my Farsi, I can understand and I can speak it, but it sucks. I have a very heavy American accent. I have people who are Iranian that are in my family that like make fun of that accent, which deters me from speaking. So I kind of, want to just echo off of that feeling, not on one side, but also not on both sides. It's almost as if we're creating a new perspective, a little bit of both. And I think the main reason why I kind of not gravitate more, but I guess connect more with the American identity is because I don't share the same struggles as Iranian, especially those who are in Iran, especially the women in Iran, who, don't have the freedom to dissent, don't have the freedom to, show their hair or express themselves. But I just wanted to kind of go back into the book and specifically the ending and just piggyback off what Milo mentioned about kind of ending it on an ambiguous note. And I thought the notes of magical realism was so interesting and fascinating throughout the book, kind of like dreaming and these dream sequences that are kind of like escapism, moments of escapism, moments that Cyrus kind of escapes his struggle with identity through these little dream sequences that he sometimes is conscious of, like consciously making up these dream sequences. But I thought was so interesting. But I wanted to know how everyone felt about the ending, and ending it on a note of magical realism, because I interpret it as a more optimistic, and more hopeful note, but those who rightfully so thought it as more like a nihilistic or an end, or a death, because he uses magical realism to create an ambiguous interpretation. Does that make it problematic in the concept of martyrdom? And martyrdom itself is a very, heavy topic to be juxtaposing magical realism with. So I'm just curious how people felt about. And I'm pretty sure it was intentional. I'm pretty sure Kaveh was intentional making it ambiguous, but I wonder how everyone received it. That's all. Thank you.
I'll let anyone, Ocean, I think you were next. I mean, for me, it did strike a more hopeful tone. I just also want to say, for anyone who's not aware, he chose Clarice Lispector to both open and close the book. It's relatively unusual to have a quote after the book. It's very common to have it before the book. Clarice Lispector, for everyone who doesn't know, I just discovered her recently because I've been obsessed with Brazil. She's a Ukrainian-born Jewish woman who moved to Brazil when she was young and has become one of Brazil's most celebrated literary voices. And I think, I can't put words in Kaveh's mouth. I wish he was still here. He's so amazing. But, I think to choose a writer who was a foreigner in the language she was writing in, who was an outsider, there is something about that experience of being an outsider, writing in a language that isn't the first one you heard, writing within a culture that isn't your culture, that is both very challenging, but also very hopeful in a way, because it's about human resilience. It's about the ability to adapt while still holding on to your culture. So I don't know. I read it as quite hopeful. But okay, Ocean, you're next. And once we have no hands, I know it's getting to the 2-hour point. We will wrap up.
Yes. I wanted to address the notion of names, and I also wanted to talk about the ending as well. I thought it was also very hopeful, and I was very happy to read the ending as hopeful and like kind of like a loving ending where Cyrus had someone that he had as a love, and I was really happy that it was like a queer happy ending. I wasn't expecting that. I was very happy about that, as a queer person, as a trans person. I was really happy to have like queerness integrated into the story. I was like hoping for that. Like I was like itching for that in this story. I was like, where's the queerness? Like, give me some of that. So I was like excited about that. But I also want to go back to the names thing. I really connected with the character Orchide. And myself, Ocean is a name that I gave myself. But I don't think of the given name, my Persian Farsi name, as a dead name. Like a lot of times, like trans people think of their like given name as like a dead name. I really, connected with Orkidea because like that was like a name that she gave herself. And I do have a lot of like it has come up for me as like a problem, as like, do I want to like keep my Farsi name because like it is a part of me, and like Cyrus was saying, or like Kaveh was saying, like seeing his name means a lot, like as an Iranian person, like on a book, like you want to see that, like, and it means something for other Iranians to like see an Iranian name like at an airport, like with Martyr, and like my given name is Niku, and like that means like the highest good in Farsi. That's like the translation is like the highest good you could ever be. And when I transitioned, I shortened it to Neek, and that means like good. And American people always used to call me Nico because they couldn't pronounce it, because they just don't know how to say like a long O for some reason. They would just be like, "Hey, Nico." And that always used to trigger me because I'd be like, "Say it right. Like there's two O's for a reason." So it always used to bother me because I'd be like, "Say my name right." So I don't know, like I changed my name because it's like I wanted it to be mine. And then like when Orkidea chose her own name, I was like, yeah, like that's your name, like you picked it. And I think as Iranians, like we get to own our own identity, and as Iranian Americans, we get to choose our own stories, and we get to like choose our own lives and heritage and things we connect to as ourselves. And we get to like pick apart the pieces that we connect to rather than like following this like script for ourselves. And I think that's like a really cool thing about queerness too, is that we don't have to follow the rules. And I think that kind of like scares people sometimes. And that kind of like pushes against the boundaries and like the box that people try to put us into. And when we break out of that box, it like is really freeing. And I think that is kind of like what this dream sequence is at the end, is like it's like this freedom for Cyrus and his lover, is that like it's like this beautiful like opening of the world for him. And they like break free, and they're like, wow, like look at the nature, and look at these flowers, look at this like beautiful dream we're like creating together, and look at this like world we can create with love. And I think that's like beautiful and divine. And I think that's how I interpreted the end, is that like they have this like queer life that they're creating together.
I love that. You guys, we have to wrap up. I really, do you feel like
Sorry,
you
I talked so much.
Okay.
Wait,
And then I'm
can we
gonna
say something really quick?
yes.
Okay, this is like 2 seconds. I just want to say my interpretation of the ending. At first, I was very angry because then I was like, oh, he basically mourned the life of no one. He mourned the life of Layla, not his mom. So essentially, the way I interpret it is like now he's rock bottom, but he has his lover now to kind of push him out of that spot. And now he can just focus on his own life completely. Like Cyrus can just be his own person in every way, because he spent so much time mourning someone who wasn't dead, who ended up like living her own life without.
Exactly.
So the fact that he's now able, like he can now do that completely and honestly
For himself.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we just want to say like that. And then the ending where he said being sober means being alive with yourself 24 hours a day. That whole paragraph of being alone, how to like get away from distractions and just focus on who you are as a person, all of that resonated with me deeply, because it's hard being alone with your thoughts sometimes when they're dark or when they gear towards the negative. But now Cyrus has a lover who can pull him out of those thoughts. Like now his thoughts are not about mother, father, my old life. Now it's focused on
my lover, and now what do I want my life to look like? And I guess Kaveh answered that in his own way, where he said meaningful life for him is helping people who are going through recovery. So I kind of see a little bit of Cyrus and Kaveh to Cyrus. They kind of feel like this, not the same exact person to me, but they feel very
Towards the end.
Yeah, it was very beautiful writing.
And we just want to thank you guys
For
so
hol-
much for facilitating this conversation and being in a space where obviously Iranians and also non-Iranians can really, we can really relate to the story, but just mostly us being Iranian, we have never felt more proud to be Iranian and reading this book, and just even the way that we picked it up, and it just leading to such a beautiful conversation. We want to thank everybody.
It's our
so
first book read by a male Iranian author. We've read Stationery Shop, Lion Women of Tehran, Reading Lolita in Tehran, all of them by amazing Iranian women. But this was the first time we've seen a book written by an Iranian man, and it was just as good.
Yeah.
Just as good, if not more real than the other stories.
For
So
sure.
And Abdi, I'm sorry.
Abdi, we're gonna read your work
books
too.
And then
Oh,
we're gonna give
thank you. Thank you.
We were literally Googling it as you were talking about it. Like we will be reading.
Read only this beautiful moment if you pick one. It's my favorite. But I just want to say, because you mentioned what Kaveh said about his work in recovery and giving back, and also just his work in doing the book. And I know, Ocean, we've talked offline about your amazing work with young queer kids. I do a lot of work with young queer youth. I try and always show up for the community. That all of us should take this conversation, hopefully, into the real world, be there for people, find ways to connect. I think one thing we saw in this conversation is how much commonality there is and how many points of connection there are. And then I'll turn it over the final word to Alireza Can. But thank you, Farhang Foundation, for giving us as Iranians a space to have this kind of conversation, not just today, but so often through all of your amazing work. So I'll give you the goodbye.
Thank you all. It's been incredible listening to this great conversation, and we're so grateful to Abdi and Kaveh for today's totally engaging discussion about such an unforgettable and powerful book. And thank you to all of you who joined us from across the globe and participated in the conversation. This is the premiere episode of Farhang Literature, and we will certainly have more episodes coming up. So if you do have any authors or books that you recommend, you can email us, and we're in the process of selecting our next book. As always, we welcome you to visit farhang.org for all of Farhang Foundation's latest programs, events, and performances. Thank you again for joining us today. It's been an amazing experience to sit here and listen to everyone's input. And again, what a great gift this book has been for us all. We bid you farewell. Thank you, Abdi Can, again. And until then, be umid didar. Bye-bye.